This is our last unit for biology. So we are going to talk about ecology for the next 2 weeks, and then we will be done with your biology course. So when we are talking about ecology for our last unit, if you remember from the very beginning of the year, there are different levels of organization for living organisms. All right, so the smallest is an atom. Atoms make molecules, molecules together make cells, cells make organ systems, and organ systems all working together make an organism, so like a human. Groups, so that's about what we've started to study so far. We are now going to look at how all these organisms interact in a bigger level of biology. So how organisms, groups of organisms are called populations. Groups of different populations make up a community. Different communities make up an ecosystem, and then all the ecosystems on Earth make up a biosphere. So biosphere is the highest level of organization, atom is our lowest. Okay, so what is ecology, and why do we care about it? Ecology is a scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environments and how energy transfer occurs. So we're going to look a lot on how energy transfer is happening between plants and animals, in between different animals, etc. Okay, so it's all about relationships and how everything is connected. All right, so biodiversity is something you're going to hear a lot in biology. So what this means is in a certain area, how many total species you have and how many different types of species do you have in an area. So let's say in this picture, for coral reefs are one of our most biodiverse ecosystems on Earth, versus let's say if you're going out into a grassland, there's not going to be as many different types of animals if we're thinking like bigger organisms, deer, etc. Versus coral reefs are very concentrated, high numbers of species and very different types, corals, fish, etc. All right, so environments are all what we're going to be talking about. So an environment is going to be made up of two things. Okay, the first one, obviously since we're talking about biology, the biotic factors. So these are living organisms that are on Earth. Okay, so anything that's living that we talked about that is biology is a biotic factor. Now, obviously, animals don't just live with other living things. There are also the soil, how much water you have, air movement. Those are all abiotic factors. Okay, so these are the non-living parts of the environment. Okay, so we're going to look at different environments and how they're related. Ecology itself starts at the individual level down here. So let's say this caribou by itself. And then obviously, as we said earlier, these all build upon each other. So individuals make a population, so we can look at that, how different populations interact in a community. So for this case, how moose, owl, rabbits, beavers, etc. all interact. And then how these communities interact within their entire area that they live in would be the ecosystem. And then what we said was the ecosystems make up biomes, and different biomes make up the whole entire biosphere of the Earth. All right, here's some definitions for the different levels. So if you want to pause it and write down, you can. If not, and you know what most of this is, you're good to go. All right, so organisms are individuals. Individuals make up populations that are interbreeding, so they're species, and that they're going to compete. Communities are interacting populations. And then finally, when we hit ecosystem, this is when we're talking about both the biotic, so the populations, and the abiotic factors. So this is when we're going to bring in the actual like Earth and different things that they're interacting with. All right, and then different ecosystems make up the entire biosphere. All right, so a couple things that we'll talk about when we're talking about environments and ecosystems is how many individuals there are in an area. So how densely populated that ecosystem or community is. This is going to change depending on amount of food, etc. Some places can have very high population densities, some might be very, very spread out. Okay, so we're talking like lions versus zebras. Okay, not a lot of lions, but there's a ton of zebras in one area. All right, dispersion is going to be the tendency of animals to spread out. So they obviously don't want to be on top of each other 24/7, because if you guys were on top of each other 24/7, it would not be a happy time. So this is going to be limited by food, space, humans, or disease. Okay, so these are all going to change how populations move and inhabit an area. All right, so a habitat is where an organism lives. So it's basically like its home address. When we say the word niche, this is what the organism's role in the community is. So what it does, what it needs. This is kind of like its job. So if we were talking about you, your habitat would be your house, and your niche would be, right now, a student. Okay? There is something called the competitive exclusion principle, and this means that when two species that are in the same niche, so two students, if we're talking about, cannot coexist if they're competing, okay? So they cannot coexist in the same area because of competition. So if you were competing with one of your friends, you would not be in the same area, that kind of idea. All right, niche is determined by the tolerance limitations of an organism, or something what we call a limiting factor. All right, so this is going to be either abiotic, which means it's not living, or biotic effects that restricts the existence of an organism in that environment. So amount of food, amount of water, temperature, amount of space, availability of mates are a couple different examples. We've already talked about what autotrophs are. We said that they make their own food. So these are going to be the producers in an environment. So when we get onto food webs, we're going to talk about the producers, which is the first level. We're going to go on from there. So autotrophs are either going to undergo photosynthesis, which we make food and oxygen from the sun using energy from the sun. There's also what we call chemosynthesis, which means they're making food using energy from inorganic molecules. So things that are not building blocks for living things. So rocks are made out of mostly inorganic molecules, other objects. So there are some bacteria that can do that. But the main part is that producers are the bottom of the food chain. They are the very first thing that everybody else consumes in order to transfer energy. So they grab the sunlight to transfer the energy from the sun, and then they're going to pass it on to the rest of the individuals in their ecosystem. All right, so the consumers are the ones that are going to be eating the producers. So these were those heterotrophs that we talked about when we were talking about photosynthesis. These are going to be the ones that cannot make their own food, so they have to get it from another source. There are 4 different ones that we are going to talk about in an ecosystem. So these are going to be herbivores, where they eat plants only, carnivores, which eat other animals only, omnivores, which is what we are. Unless you refuse to eat veggies, then you're a carnivore. But you should be an omnivore, where you're eating both plants and animals. And then we also have our detrivores, or our decomposers. So these are breaking down dead things and returning those nutrients to the soil. So they're recycling a lot of our nutrients that we need, and we're going to talk about those cycles later on. Feeding relationships. There are 3 different types. So this is how things are interacting. We have a producer-consumer feeding relationship, which means the consumers are eating the producers and how they're interacting, the predator-prey relationship, and the parasite-host relationship. So these are how food is going to get transferred and organisms are getting their energy from others. We also have what are called symbiotic relationships. So symbiosis means 2 species live together, right? So however they interact, whether it's positive, negative, not really an effect, that's what we look at in symbiosis. There are 3 different types. So commensalism, parasitism, and mutualism, right? And these all have different characteristics. For those of you who like Disney movies and are obsessed with Finding Nemo, this is a symbiotic relationship between the anemones and the clownfish. All right, so when they were like shuffling through the anemones' tentacles, that was protecting the clownfish from the anemone, but the anemone gets some benefit from it also. So this is a relationship that biologists can study and see how the different organisms are interacting. Okay, so our first one is commensalism. This means that one species benefits and the other one is not harmed nor helped. So one gets a nice benefit from interacting with the other one really doesn't care what's going on. So if you look in this picture, we have little birds over here among the buffalo. So these birds, in this case, are just eating insects off of the buffalo. These insects are really not affecting the buffalo or water bison too much, but they're just there. So the water buffalo is not getting a benefit from it, but these birds, because they're hanging around them, get to eat all the insects and flies, etc., that are around the water buffalo. Okay, so it's a positive relationship for the bird. It's just a I don't care relationship for the water buffalo. Okay, so most of the time you'll see symbiotic relationships represented by this. So for the one organism, it's a positive effect. The other one, there's really no effect at all. Okay, parasitism. So these are what you call all the parasites you think of, little bugs, etc. So one species is going to benefit. That would be the parasite, obviously, because it's getting food from the host. Okay, the host is actually harmed in this relationship. All right, so that's kind of important. This is not one where both are benefiting something. This is actually where one is actually getting a disservice by having that other organism there. So in this case, we have a positive for the parasite and negative for the host. So this is our parasite-host relationship. So ticks are parasites for us, mosquitoes are parasites for us, any of those intestinal parasites you think of, those are all parasitic relationships. So they are using us as food source, but we are not getting a benefit. We're actually getting harmed. We are either getting diseases from either of these two animals, or if you have in a digestive system parasite, that's actually harming you because you're losing nutrients and food directly. All right, mutualism. This means it benefits both species. All right, so this is the happier one. So this is going to be represented by a plus plus. So with crocodiles, so this picture over here, there are birds that actually will eat insects and other bugs that are trying to be almost parasitic to the crocodiles. So these birds actually come in and eat those, so the birds get a benefit of food. The crocodiles then get to get rid of those parasites that would obviously harm them. So this is a benefit to both. So unlike the water buffalo, where the water buffalo was just the flies were getting eaten, so the water buffalo is not affected by a fly. With the crocodile, this is getting rid of parasites. And there are some birds that get rid of parasites and other things around buffalo, zebras, etc. also. The one main one in the insect world is, if you ever heard of an acacia tree, these are trees with really big thorns. So these ants actually get to live in those thorns, which gives them a home. And the acacia tree actually benefits from the ants being there, because these ants can sting or bite things that are trying to attack the tree. So if you would go over to an acacia tree and start trying to cut it down, etc., you might see all these little ants coming at you, and they will hurt. Okay? This is a mutualistic relationship because they are protecting the tree is giving them a home, both species benefit. Okay, so this is just a table that's it's going to summarize all three of these relationships. So if it's neutral, this is a dot here, which means commensalism is our one where one benefits, the other one's neutral. Parasites, one is harmed, but one benefits. And then mutualism is where both are beneficial. Trophic levels are things we are going to talk about when we're talking about food webs, food chains, everything interacting in an ecosystem. So these are going to start at the bottom and go up. So producers are going to be the ones at the bottom, and then we have what are called primary consumers, and then secondary consumers and tertiary. It really doesn't go far past tertiary for a reason that we're going to explain in a little bit. Okay, so when you look at a food web or a food chain, every time you jump from one level to another, those are the different trophic levels. So this first one with the grass and the tree is going to be our primary producers. So that's our first trophic level. And then those things that eat them are the primary consumers. The things that then eat the primary consumers are the secondary. Okay, so this is a trophic level, this is a trophic level, and this one is. Okay, these are all going to look at transfers of energy and matter in an ecosystem. This is our important part and why we even study these. All right, here's a bigger food web where we actually expand this even farther, where we get primary producers, primary consumers, and then secondary and tertiary consumers. All right, obviously there's a ton of interaction, and not one thing is going to affect just one other thing. So if you look, like if all of a sudden we took wildebeest out of this environment, hyenas, lions, cheetahs, servals, and eagles are all going to be affected by these not existing anymore. Okay, so you can see how these are all very interconnected, and if we affect one, we can affect lots of things past it. So if you, obviously the lower levels that you affect are going to affect more things later on versus affecting a population of the tertiary consumers isn't going to have as much of a direct effect originally, but then you could have these individuals all of a sudden, because they're not getting eaten by this certain animal, start overpopulating. Okay, so all of this is very complexly interconnected. When we're talking about an ecosystem, biomass is what we're going to study. So this is the amount of organic matter comprising a group of organisms in a habitat. So it's basically just how much living matter there is in an area. When we're talking about a food chain, the most biomass is going to be at the bottom, and as we move up, energy and biomass is going to decrease. Okay, so energy is going to be transferred upwards, but it isn't as much as the level before. So if you look at this energy pyramid, every time we move up from one level to another, we only pass on 10% of that energy. So with primary producers being at 100%, when those consumers eat those producers, only 10% of that original energy is passed on. So by the time you get to the third level, only 1.1%, so 1/10 of the original 100% energy has been transferred. So most of this is going to be lost in heat. So that other 90% that we're losing is all lost in heat to the environment from those organisms. Okay, so if you look at this energy pyramid, so this is actually measured in joules, so this is our measure of energy for science. If we have 1,000,000 joules of sunlight coming in, those primary producers, so plants, are going to capture 1/10 of that, which is 10,000 joules. All right, then we're going to go up and hit 1/10 of that, which is 1,000, 100, and only 10 joules make it to the snakes of the original 1,000,000 joules of sunlight. So this is a major drop in energy. But the important part is the most biomass and most energy in an ecosystem is the very first level in the trophic levels. So in this case, it's always going to be our producers. Okay, so these have the most biomass and most energy available. Top trophic level then is the one that will have the least amount of energy, obviously shown by this picture.